Hey guys, thanks again for coming out today. My name's Sean Wakely. I'm the director of Hackfort. How many of you guys were out last night? A few of you. Okay, good. Well, man, it's really, day one was wild. So I think it's going to be a really fun week. I am super pumped to have my friend Ramsey here. Funnily enough, I didn't realize it when I was making the schedule. If you weren't in the room, Zach, who just presented, and Ramsey and I all worked together for Apple like 10 years ago or more. It's like more than that now.
Yeah, 2012. I was there till 2017. So.
Yeah, I mean, pretty wild, but it's really funny. I didn't even think about that. And, you know, we were all really close friends and nerds when we worked there. And now we're all nerds here. So, wow, that's crazy to think about. So anyways, please have some fun. Ramsey, I'm going to turn it over to you. We are going to have some Q&A at the end, but we'll have someone pass around the microphone because we are recording this. We want to make sure we get it all. Thanks, Ramsey. Turn it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Sean. Thanks, Hackfort, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you guys today, and thanks for coming to my presentation. So, anything else? No, I think let's get started. So, my talk today is on code generation tools, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll kind of get a sound understanding of what I mean by code generation, how can we use it in industry, and how it'll make you either a better programmer, better developer. So a little backstory on me. So I am a full stack engineer at truckstop.com. I've been there for 2 years. Prior to that, I worked at a small mechanical engineering firm out in Meridian called DC Engineering. And then before that, I worked at a small startup called Black Sage. Over the past, when I got to Truckstop, we had a lot of services. We have a microservice architecture, and a lot of the services were in sort of disarray. And so in the last 6 months, I've really worked with our GraphQL API to use code generation tools to allow a lot of our services to call into this API a lot more effectively and efficiently. So that's been my primary work for the last 6 months. Before that, I've done everything from database development and implementation to front-end development and really just jack of all trades. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is code generation, what real-world problems does it solve. I'll talk about 2 different tools, NSwag and GraphQL CodeGen. I've got a quick little demo that if people are interested, I'll keep doing there. We'll try to work with the small font up here. And then I'll have some questions. How many people here are in the industry? So how many people are either developers or in the industry? Okay, cool, sweet. So it's funny, Zach talked about ChatGPT in the previous chat. I also asked ChatGPT, hey, what's the definition of code generation? Because when I use these tools every single day, I think I lose sight of what the textbook definition for these terms are. So I asked it what it was, and thankfully it was very similar to what I had. I did learn that in around the 1950s and 60s, there were first code generation tools. But typically in modern context, when we think of code generation, we think of, it became popular after Swagger and Open API became popular in about 2010 and really picked up steam in 2015 and later. So when I talk about code generation, I'm not necessarily talking about what you do with, let's say, ChatGPT, where you say, hey, write me code that if it's an odd number, print foo, and if it's an even number, print buzz, and if it's divisible by these two, print fizzbuzz or foobuzz or whatever it is. That's not the code generation I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is taking like an open API specification or a database schema and feeding it through tools to generate either C#, TypeScript, Flutter, even JavaScript clients and contracts as well. And with these generation tools, these code generation tools like NSwag and GraphQL CodeGen, you can make minor tweaks to them and change the language you develop, change the namespaces that will get generated for you, all sorts of different things. And we'll see that in the demo. and when we talk about NSWAG in particular. So if you're not a technologist and you still have no idea what I'm talking about, I used an analogy for, or the best analogy for code generation I should think of is a franchise, right? So I'm Papa John in this instance, right? And I want to open up franchises all over the place, but I just don't give them the menu and I say, hey, go make this work, because that will be inconsistent across the board, right? So they don't do that. They say, here's the menu, here's the recipe, here's how we make things, here are the ingredients. And they do that, so no matter which restaurant you go to, you're getting the same experience. And that's a little bit similar to, or that is similar to code gen. I'm not just saying, hey, here's my API. Yeah, call into it, right? I call 200 for successful, 204, whatever. I'm giving them a specification and they can feed it through these tools, and I can generate either like NuGet packages or NPM packages. I can distribute that to my other microservices, and they can all call into our services and have a consistent just consistency across the board when they're calling into my services. So, okay, some real world problems, okay? So I've got a small microservice architecture up here. And if you're not in technology, you don't know really what that means, but it's a great buzzword if you're like out at a show later and you're just like, oh, hey, microservice, whatever. But if you're in the industry, you know what I'm talking about. So I've got a small example of a microservice architecture up here. I've got a mobile application. I've got my web application. And we all know we're supporting our old mobile application as well, because maybe we haven't implemented everything in our new mobile app. Maybe we just haven't gotten around to changing it. And maybe that will never change, but it is what it is. So I have to support all of these services calling into my user's API. My user's API is pretty simple. It's got a create, an update, a delete, login, log out. Really pretty standard stuff. Nothing crazy here. But if I want to implement calling into that service, I've got to communicate with the mobile team who might be offshore. I've got to communicate with the web team. I've got to communicate with the old mobile app team or the guys that are maintaining that service. And what if that backend service that I'm calling into is payments? Maybe that backend service wants to call into my user's API, but that service is written in C#. This one's written in Flutter, and that one's written in TypeScript. How can I get consistency across the board and move to production a lot faster? Because we all know that's what product cares about. They want to move stuff to production to make money as fast as possible. So with code generation tools, that user's API can define a specification. And I know if you're in the industry, you've seen like a JSON for Open API or JSON Open API spec. You've seen a Swagger page. Even people that aren't in the industry have seen a Swagger page. These Swagger pages give you a JSON, and they define the specification for that user API. And you can take that specification, feed it through these tools, and generate code for both your web, mobile, your new backend service if you want, and your old mobile application. Okay, so I mentioned GraphQL at the beginning of my talk, and I want to talk a little bit about REST APIs and GraphQL APIs. It's a little sidestep, but I'll bring it back together. So a REST API is a way for two computers to communicate with each other over the web using HTTP requests. Pretty simple. The service that's getting called defines what the input properties are or the input parameters are and what the responses are. So they'll define, hey, you give me a username, a password, and an ID. Well, I return to you either like say okay or no. But it can also say unauthorized or a bad request, all that kind of stuff. And that's defined by the service that's getting called. GraphQL is a little bit different. GraphQL is a front-end query language. How many people have worked with GraphQL? Anybody here? No? Okay, a little bit. Okay. GraphQL is a front-end query language, and I'll show you some examples in a little bit. It's super, super fast to stand up. It's incredibly flexible, and it allows the calling service to define what input parameters and what response properties it wants. So a front-end application could say, hey, I want the users that match this ID, and I want their username, I want their password, not really, but you get what I mean. Their username, their password, I want their first name, last name, and their address. And if those might be in different tables, and that's fine, because what GraphQL will do is it'll convert your query into a PostgreSQL query and execute that against your database. Joins, everything. It'll do it all for you. So it's incredibly flexible, super fast. The problem is it's hard to maintain consistency. Because the queries are defined on the front end, what happens is you get different applications, like in that example where I showed you've got the mobile application, you've got the web application. Those teams have to communicate with each other and say like, hey, we're calling into the users table to get this data. And it's important for us to get a first and last name, right? The mobile application has to write the same query on their platform as the web application. And it can get confusing because you get to define on the front end which properties you're requesting from the database. So I guess I'll talk about it in the next slide, but kind of what I've done at truckstop.com is taken all of those queries, brought them into a single location, and then generated code from those queries and the schema to allow all of the calling services to call into the GraphQL API and maintain consistency across the board. Okay, so I'll talk about GraphQL CodeGen. I mentioned it a little bit. So what GraphQL CodeGen allow you to do is allows you to pass in a schema up at the top. I don't know, it's hard to see, but on line 2, it's passing in a schema. And then down here, I'm defining my queries, my mutations, and then also that foo string, that's part of a fragment. So it's defining what I want back from the database. And I can feed all of that information into GraphQL CodeGen and generate TypeScript clients, contracts, and I can even generate C#. And we'll see an example here in a second. Where I found that this product is incredibly important is in testing as well. Because we all know we can do unit tests on the front end, we can do end-to-end tests, but what about integration tests? What about testing, creating a user on, going back to the microservice architecture, what about creating a user on the mobile application and then logging in on the web application? How do we simulate that pattern? How do we test that? That has to be testable. And when we generate code for it, we know that it's consistent across the board. All right, the second technology is called NSWAG. And when you pull up this repository, you'll see that it is huge. There are so many configuration options, more than the GraphQL CodeGen by far. So many configuration options. So how many people here know Swagger? Swagger? Yeah, people work with Swagger. Okay. Swagger is, and I bet you when I show you the picture, some of you guys will be like, oh, I've seen that before. But Swagger is a tool that we build open API specifications. And Open API is different than OpenAI, which is OpenAI's ChatGPT. Open API is the specification file that defines our REST endpoints or REST APIs. And you can feed, you'll see, you can feed those from JSON, from a URL, from a schema, and you can pass it in to NSWAG, and it will generate TypeScript clients, C# clients, and contracts as well. So it's pretty cool. It became popular, I think, around like 2012. I think the first Swagger toolchain came out, and then since then, it's really picked up popularity. In fact, now if you guys create, and I have to say, rarely do I create a new service. I'm always working on existing services, but for this talk, I created a REST API using just Visual Studios. And it generated Swagger. It generates a Swagger documentation for you already. So you just literally create your own, create your service, and you already have Swagger's already built into Visual Studio. And you can, I'll show you, you can export that JSON and just feed it right into these code generation tools. It's pretty cool. Okay, So now we'll get into some demo. So trigger warning, there's some code here. Okay, so I've created this small microservice. I stood up a GraphQL API that's pointing to a Postgres database. And I used Hasura, and Hasura is a GraphQL engine that you can stand up a GraphQL API in minutes. I filled it with some data, and I made it a zoo. So I have a zoo, and I have a list of animals in this database. So we're going to be using that. And what I did was I created a web interface that's in Angular, and we'll be able to see our list of animals. We'll be able to select them by ID, do some sorting and filtering. I built a testing suite to test my API to make sure that all right, testing, whoop, whoop. All right, a test to make sure that when I pass in certain properties that I'm getting what I expect. Or let's say I pass in, hey, give me all the carnivores, that I actually get back only animals that are carnivores. So I'm going to test that as well. Now, this is a real world situation. What if I want, I have this zoo, the web interface shows my list of animals that I have at the zoo, but what if I want to allow the state of Idaho to access my list of animals so they can keep track of all the animals in the state, right? For some reason. But I don't necessarily want them to access my GraphQL API directly. So I wrote a wrapper around it. I created an external API, which is a REST API. Because if they were to call into the GraphQL API, they'd have to know how to use GraphQL. And I just don't really want them to be able to do that. So I created a RESTful API for them. And with that, I've got a JSON schema or an Open API spec that I wrote. And you'll see how I can feed that Open API spec through NSWAG to generate code and clients. So, ready? All right. Okay. So can you guys see that okay? Yeah? Okay. Maybe I can, no, my brightness is all the way up. Okay. So I created 3 different projects, okay? The first project that I'm showing here is a Node.js project. And in it, I've implemented some code gen tools. I call this my code gen project. And right now we're looking at a configuration file. And GraphQL is built on, what is it called? It's called, there's a certain, slips my mind. Cosmic config. I don't know if any of you guys have used Cosmic config, but GraphQL API or CodeGen is built on Cosmic config, which allows it to take in different configuration files. So up here, actually, I've got the same configs because I'm a nerd, and I did it in YAML as well. So it'll take in YAML, it'll take in JSON, but I like TypeScript, so that's what I'm using. And this project is really cool, actually. So up there in the schema, I'm pointing at a URL. Now, that's not a schema, right? That's a URL. It's pointing at my GraphQL API. But what's really cool about this tool is you can set a watch variable on it. So if I make changes to that schema, it will actually regenerate my code for me. And you can see that once you start to put this together with CI/CD, you can publish NuGet packages, you can publish NPM packages. And so services that want to implement this just up their version and they get the new, you know? So I'm pointing at a URL up there. You'll see I'm using my documents, and I'll talk about documents here. For GraphQL, well, let's go to this. I've got 3 queries here. Everything is going to be small. You're not going to zoom in. Okay, so I've got a get animal query. I've got an get animal inventory by diet, and I've got by building, right? And I'm going to return back this ... is basically a variable. It's called a fragment, and it defines a list of properties I want back from the database. And you can see the query is where building name equals building, right? So this would be hard for somebody to learn and just call into this, which is why we created that external API. So my CodeGen is pointing at those schemas right here, or those GraphQL files, and I'm generating a GraphQL.TypeScript.ts here. I'm using these plugins. operations, Apollo Angular. I'm also going to generate C# at the same time. So I'm using another one. I'm going to generate it in operations and C#, and types. And I'm going to spit these files out in those generated folders you see up at the top. Now, C# is a little bit, TypeScript's kind of the wild, wild west. Like, we can do whatever we want. But C#, you have to define a little bit what these properties will be translate over. So all I have to do is run npm run generate. Boom. And you'll see up there, I've generated TypeScript. I've generated all this code. I don't even look at it. I mean, I know what it does, but it's like 2,000 lines of code that I didn't have to write. All it is based off of that config. At the same time, I generated all the types in C#, and I generated all the operations as well. So you can see, I'll show you what a GraphQL query looks like. That's a raw GraphQL query, all that green. Nobody wants to write that. But with this, we'll see how easy it is to call into that. Okay, well, let's do an example before we jump over to the NSWAG portion of this. Okay, I've got an Angular application. Let me serve it up. How many people work with Angular here? Nobody? Okay. What about TypeScript? Anybody? A little bit? Okay, sweet. All right, let's check it out. Let's see what we get here. Okay, so I've got a list of animals. Oh, let's see if we can. Is that better? Okay, cool. All right, so I've got a list of animals, and I can click on, I want animals that are in the Roosevelt cooler, right? Let's see what they're, okay, sweet, I filtered the list down. What about all the carnivores? Pretty simple, basic application. I can click on a name. Oh, sorry, let's see what band it is. Okay, cool. He is a stoat. It's awesome. Really fascinating things here. Okay, but you can see this is just a basic application. I'm getting a bunch of data back. I'm requesting a bunch of stuff. I'm filtering. Let's take a look at the code. All right, let's take a look at that get animal by ID, that last one where I clicked on a name. I'm getting that animal by ID. Really, you're not gonna zoom in for all my, okay. All right, so here I am. I'm creating a subscription. I'm passing in variables with that animal ID, and I'm actually making this GraphQL query. And GraphQL was made popular by Facebook, which is why I think everybody really likes it. But it's also super fast to stand up. You just make a GraphQL API, within minutes, people are calling into it. So this is getting an animal by ID. I'm calling in, I'm saying, hey, I want to get the animal by primary key. And these are all the things I want. I want the class, I want the common name, I want the family, genus, species, right? But like, where is this type defined? We're not creating a class and saying like this, because I don't want to do that. Do you want to split your window and say like, class equals this, and you want to create all those? There's a better way. Okay. So somebody wrote this, and we're going to convert this using CodeGen. Okay. So if we jump over to our code generator, you'll see, really quick, just check my time. Okay. You'll see, here's that query. Get animal by ID, primary key. I'm passing in the ID. It's a UUID, and I want that fragment back. So I'm able to abstract that right here. So I can reuse this. I can reuse this in other queries if I want. And I've defined a type. That's the most important part. I've defined a type of what I want back. Okay. And so I already generated the code. There it is. And to save us time, I already copied and put it over on the web application. All we need to do is call it. So we're going to get rid of all this garbage. Okay. And we're just going to do this because I know what it's called. But we're going to import it here. I'm going to pass in my variable, so my ID, and I want this animal ID. I'm going to subscribe to it. I want my data back. Boom, sweet. It even gave me my IntelliSense saying this is the type you want back. So my loading to false. Okay, cool. So now let's see if this works. Oops, that's not the one I want. I want this one. Let's see if I click on here, it'll give me back the same thing. There you go. So I was able to take that code, put it into a code generation, and then I was able to call it in just a single line. Does anybody have questions on that so far? Okay, cool. Okay, so I generated TypeScript. There it is. And I'll show you another component actually. This component has 3 of those requests. I'm getting all animals by inventory. I'm calling that method. And actually, you know what? It's cool. Is that if I step in this, you guys can see this is in the, this is in the generated file. And you'll see it's using Apollo Angular. And I defined that in my code generation, in my config file. I said you can use Apollo Angular. There are other plugins you can use if you want to use something differently. The other ones escape my mind right now, but there are other ways to call into GraphQL APIs. So there's my get animal inventory by ID. And you'll see here are my fragments. They're up here. They're already defined. Okay, sweet. All right. So, like I said sorry to jump around so much, but I generated the operations and types file in C#. So let's go take a look at a C# application. And early on, I mentioned testing as well. So I've got 3 projects in here. Can't really see the top. The top one is animal inventory. Then I've got the API below it. And then I have a tester. Okay. So if I go into this testing suite, I'm calling into this GraphQL service, right? And this GraphQL service is saying, I want to get all the animals by building. And I'm testing this. I'm passing in the string that I want to get back. I'm saying that the animal types must match the type that I expect. And all these types, those are from the generated file. I didn't write in everything that I did here, I didn't write a single class. I just used generated code for all of it. And I loop through these animals and I expect that their building name is equal to this, right? And I can run these tests. Run them all. Oh my gosh, one failed. Almost like I planned it there. All right, so let's take a look at that service. Oh, we don't want to go in there. Okay, looks like one not implemented, so we get to do that together. Okay, so this service, and see, like I said before, C# is a little bit tricky, but with GraphQL, we're calling into GraphQL, C#, yeah, like I said, can get a little tricky. So you have to write a little bit of a wrapper around these requests, but you don't have to write any queries or mutations. So we need to get the animal by ID, right? And you'll see some familiar method names here in a second. So I'm already passing in a variable. So I'm going to say ID equal, oh no, I'm going to do variables. Say that ID. And that query that I had before was the get animal by ID GQL. It was the same in TypeScript, and it's the same in the generated code in C#. Same method name. You can call request, pass in this variables, and I'm gonna get the client by ID, and I'm gonna pass in this query. All right, let's take a look. We're gonna go into this client now and make sure that this is implemented. And actually, you know what? I'm gonna go back really quick. We're gonna click on this so you guys can see the definition. There's that GraphQL query. This is massive string. And when I came to TruckStop, they were using string interpolation to generate these strings on the fly. So nobody knew which properties were actually in them because we would pass in an object and they would just loop through the object. And if the object wasn't named the same as that up there, you'd get an error. But nobody really knew because it was just a loop. So it was just like, okay. And their attitude was, well, it works. I said, no, it doesn't really work. So let's go into this client. All right. And this one's not implemented as well. So let's fix that. Say data. I'm going to wait. And I wrote this execute query method down here. I'm going to pass in that GraphQL query that I just grabbed from that generated code. I'm going to deserialize it. And I'm going to deserialize it. Types. And I'm going to do that animal inventory. Nobody's live coding session has ever gone this well. It's true. Yeah, it's true. It just worked a few minutes ago. Okay, let's see if my test passes now. Looks good. Sweet. So this GraphQL client and this GraphQL service, it works for my testing suite. But what if I were to implement that? Let me check my time. Okay, a few more minutes and I'll be done. What if I wanted to implement that into a web API, that external API that I talked about? So I've got this controller here, and I'm going to start this up so you guys can see really quick. I want to talk about NSWAG too, so I'll hurry. So I'm going to run this, and under the hood, I'm still calling that GraphQL service. And that GraphQL service is what you can put into an NPM package. So you're combining your generated code with some small methods to kind of deserialize the data, and that's just for C#. Okay. This guy up here, has anybody seen these? Knows what Swagger pages? Okay, right there, that JSON up there, that's an open API spec. So you can take this and you can feed it through NSWAG to generate code for you. And we're going to do that right now. So you can just, here it is, right here. It's publicly exposed on those Swagger pages. You can just grab it. So let's go back to that code generation project that I had. I'm going to close all this stuff here. I'm not talking about GraphQL anymore. We're going to talk about NSWAG. Okay. So NSWAG, I take in that JSON. There it is. And I feed it through this tool. And I wrote a bash script to wrap the NSWAG commands. I'm going to generate the contracts. So I use -c to generate contracts. And up here, you'll see contract.cs. So this generated the contract for me based off of that open API specification. I didn't do anything. Okay. So now I can come back over here. And if you'll see, I can try out, I'll zoom out a little bit. I can try this endpoint out. I can execute it. So remember, under the hood, this is calling my GraphQL API, but I'm expecting this in response. And this is the code. Those object types, those are the types that get generated on the calling service. So they can take that spec, feed it through their own code generator, and generate these contracts for them. So they don't have to look at this and say, oh, there's a common name, it's a string, a building name's a string. It'll just generate that for them. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks.
When I heard the talk, I thought it was like, IntelliJ kind of senses what you're trying to do when you're in an IDE.
Yeah.
And, you're talking about actually like creating the code. Do you see this? Maybe this, I'm kind of a lot of things in my head I wanted to ask you, but do you see this more as like bootstrapping things or even like decommissioning a legacy application because it's written in some other language and you need to like move it to this other language? Or what do you see as like the practical application of like how people are going to use this, to solve problems?
Yeah. Like I kind of mentioned before, taking stuff to production a lot faster. And so if you're obviously familiar with a microservice architecture, where you have a bunch of services calling into a bunch of other services, you're all connected through a web. And what can happen is you can get inconsistencies across the board. So the way we use this at Truck Stop is we have our own internal NuGet package and NPM registries. And any code that we generate, we put in NPM packages there. So only Truck Stop users can use it. Only our services can use it. But it allows us to import those in. So if you're maybe calling into our geolocation service and you want to say, well, I have to write, I have to import in the HTTP client. I have to, catch different errors to return different response codes. All that stuff takes time. But if you can just import in the Truck Stop geolocation NuGet package that has a bunch of generated code in it, well, then you don't really have to do anything. And that's where I see code generation tools being really effective. And when you combine it with like CI/CD, that's where it gets really powerful, because you can just kick off those NuGet packages, increment the version number, and nobody had to do no manual process had to go into that.
Nice. It requires you to have the JSON open spec though committed in your app. Like you don't have that, like that's the big hurdle.
Yeah.
To get to first to use this.
That's correct. Yeah. And so there's spec-driven architecture, which you define sort of like, test-driven design, where you write the tests first, or test-driven development, write the test first, then write the code to make sure the tests pass, or write the code and then write the test to make sure the code works. It's sort of the same with specifications. So you can write the code and then write the specification separately, or you can write the spec and then design the code after that.
So would you separate the difference between like IntelliJ and something like this? They're different kinds of code generators, or are they both code generators?
I think they're Could you explain a little bit more about are you talking about IntelliSense?
IntelliSense. My apologies. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
IntelliSense is like Visual Studios, and,
Right.
and and Copilot is kind of the Microsoft version for assistant to help you coding. Yeah, like are these all in the same category of code generators, or?
Yeah. I think I would separate them, just kind of how I separated ChatGPT. I wouldn't consider that be very careful about how I say this. I wouldn't consider that this type of code generator. ChatGPT is great for things like give me the regular expression to find all of the commas that come before the letter A and replace them with letter B, right? That's ChatGPT generates that code. There's no argument there. But with IntelliSense, it's kind of built on that same like regular expression. It's looking through your code, it's trying to find patterns, and that's how it's suggesting things to you. This is strictly based off of like the GraphQL side. You're basing it off of a database schema. And I can show and I forgot to show this. Here's my database. Right? Animal inventory, you guys saw that as the object or as the response type. It's a table. And what GraphQL CodeGen did is it looked at the table schema, and you saw those, or I should click on animal as well. When we talked about like the kingdom file and class, it looked at those columns on the table, and it looked at the types, and it generated C# and TypeScript code based off of that schema. And that's something like IntelliSense doesn't do.
Right. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure.
Thanks very much. I probably didn't need to say I have a question, because raising my hand was sufficient there. But I'm pretty new to all this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm an attorney, so my role with my startup company is like pretty non-technical. This is like got over my head like really fast, but I still find like graph databases really fascinating. And I'm kind of unclear, like with the GraphQL.
Yeah.
Is it just a query language that's extensible to a bunch of different like NoSQL like databases, or is it like parsing the data from like the NoSQL the NoSQL database into a graph and then querying that in some way that that we just don't see?
Yeah. So GraphQL is actually used with relational databases. So it's strictly relational. So I have a relational database here with 5 different tables: animal inventory, animal diet, animal sex, and then building, right? Those are all tables in my database. GraphQL, you pass in a query. So you write the query on the front end. You write it in GraphQL, which is a query language. And what happens in these APIs is it converts it to pSQL. So it will actually create SQL off of your GraphQL query and execute that on the database. So when we write, and I can show you this in an example here. So we can say, and this little code explorer and Hasura is an incredibly powerful engine that lets you use GraphQL super effectively. But here I can say, I want the animal. These are the columns I want back. But animal inventories has a foreign key mapping to the animal table. So I'm able to drill down and get those properties as well. And when I execute this, it returns back that data. But under the hood, it created a join, and it joined on those IDs, and it's returning that data for me. So that's kind of the cool thing about it, because if you had to do this in a REST API form, you'd have to write an API, you'd have to write SQL to join those tables together. And that can be a pain in the butt sometimes. Sometimes you just want to stand it up as soon as possible.
Okay, yeah. Sorry if that was kind of a dumb question. I just
Never
was,
a dumb question.
I was thrown by the fact that it's called GraphQL
Yeah.
in the first place because
Yeah.
it's like, well, it seems like it's making SQL queries in this, but then it's like
Yes.
sort of not at the same time. So
Right.
it's a cool tool though. Thanks
Yeah.
for
Of course. Yeah.
thanks for showing it to us.
Of course. Yeah.
Hi. But does this do anything to help solve the problem of changes of specification and accommodating that in the backend in the actual client side? So if like you change that open API specification in
Yeah.
any way, you can generate that out, but it's still true that each client still has to deal with that change in API on each end, or is there any tooling to help accommodate that on
Yeah.
any side? Or?
That's a good question. I think that's where the NuGet package and the NPM packages come into play. And so when the spec changes, and this gets into a little bit of an architectural discussion about like if I've got a version, let's say I have let's say we have this users API, and the users API has these 5 endpoints, and in V1 we pass in some claims, like what products they have access to, and then we want to change that. We can typically people would be like, okay, well, create a version 2 endpoint, right? But they can partner that with a NuGet package, and what can happen is you change the spec, you kick out a NuGet package, and then the calling service just has to update their version. And you're right, they will have to resolve some differences. But the cool thing about having it published in a NuGet package is that everything's going to update, right? So when you import a new service or update it, you have to resolve some conflicts at some point. Yeah, you can't get around that. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And you can have different services. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but whenever I open a service and I say, "Oh my gosh, we're on like the beta, we need to update our NuGet packages." So there's problems with maintaining things that are super old, but for the most part, it's a good thing. Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, guys. If you have any more questions for Ramsey, I'm sure he'd be happy to chat with you after this.
Yeah.
Thanks again. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, man. All right, we're just going to do another changeover here. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Good job, man. You too, Zach. Good job.